Welcome to Mining the Mysteries, a catechetical podcast that explores the depths of our Orthodox and Catholic faith in the English tradition. I'm Matthew Stewart, Digital Media Director for the Anglican Province of America, along with your hosts, Father Wade Miller and Father Randall Russell from St. Philip's Anglican Church in Blacksburg, Virginia. We're glad to have you with us as we dig deeper into the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Welcome back, folks. This week we have a special Q&A episode. So we're going to start and jump right in. The first question we have came from a YouTube listener, and he asks, what are the thoughts of the APA joining the ACNA or at least GAFCON? So, Father Miller, you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, and for those that don't know what GAFCON is, it stands for Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans, and it's a group that was founded because of the kind of revisionist and some of the progressive theology that was coming out of the Church of England and the United States, the Episcopal Church. And so it is a global, I guess, fraternity, that fellowship that is heavily, a lot of the African jurisdictions are a part of GAFCON, but it crosses boundaries, and there's churches in the United States, Church of England, that are part of GAFCON. The problem with joining them, and I would just invite people to go back and listen to what Bishop had to say about our episode on ecumenism. We can't really join something where the vast majority of those groups ordain women. And so we can work with them when it comes to some of the external things, like, say, for instance, pro-life kind of things. If there was a disaster that happened somewhere, helping, provide supplies, food, support in that way. But as far as being a part of GAFCON, that's something that we cannot be a part of, because the vast majority of those in GAFCON allow for women's ordination. So, yeah, and same with the ACNA. We can work in partnership in terms of external things, but can never really be a part of the ACNA or GAFCON, because the whole women's ordination is not a secondary issue. It is a fundamental issue for us. So,
excellent. So we will go ahead and move on to the next question, and that is, how can Anglicans make a claim of being truly Catholic when neither Rome nor the Eastern Orthodox Church recognizes them?
So, well, yeah, again, I would invite you to go back and listen to Bishop Chad on the episode where he talks about ecumenism. But yeah, the Eastern Orthodox is a little different than Rome. Rome is it looks at things in a very judicial kind of manner. And so Bishop did a good job. There's also a sacramentalist podcast. I forget when it was, but he really lays that out very well. But the Orthodox, it's not really about administration as much as it is kind of the sacramental unity. And so in Orthodoxy, it's a little more organic than that. Obviously, their desire is that everybody would come under one of the patriarchs and from there be recognized. But we are supposed to be having talks with them at St. Vladimir's, and there's a lot of agreement and consensus between the continuing church and our Orthodox brothers and sisters. And so I think that is something that's going to be explored even deeper. As far as with Rome, it's one of those things where I can't really speak authoritatively. That's something Bishop Chad could speak to, but it's problematic that even the East and Rome, although Rome would look at the East and say we recognize their orders or whatever, the Orthodox do not look at Rome that way, and there's a whole litany of reasons for that. But I think that Anglicans, again, our orders, and again, Bishop Chad's the authority on this, but our orders, we have old Catholic orders that are actually recognized by Rome. So that's a lot of political stuff that's kind of outside of my domain. But I think the important thing to know is that Anglicans believe that we should be in closer dialogue, and we would recognize, like, if somebody comes here that was Roman Catholic, we don't confirm them again. If somebody was Orthodox and they were chrismated, we don't confirm them because we recognize that they have validly been confirmed already or chrismated already. And so that's kind of where we are on that. Father, you have any thoughts on that?
I don't really have any thoughts, but I would like to kind of, if I may, you're on all the boards and you know a lot more of this stuff than I do. You do a lot of this stuff and of course work with the bishop. But that first question in regard to GAFCON and the ACNA, if we were to join with GAFCON or the ACNA, how would that affect dialogue with the East and Rome?
Yeah, I think that would probably be the nail in the coffin.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, the Orthodox started dialogues with the ACNA, and that happened in the Shota House. But since then, at least the OCA, they have walked away from that. They're the ones that reached out to us and wanted to start having talks with the Continuum. And so I know that sometime probably in late fall, that's going to happen at St. Vlad's.
So is it more something when they look at us? I mean, we're so small, but is it kind of like your orders are valid, but you're so small? It's like, why really pursue this?
Well, I think it's even a lot more innocent than that. I think the Orthodox, they look and they say, okay, there's how many different Anglican bodies. Which one do we talk to?
Yeah.
And I think that's what they're exploring right now. And they, they cut off those talks with the Episcopal Church for obvious reasons. Now the ACNA, because the women's ordination thing. So now they've come to us and they said, we really want to explore this. Obviously, we know that there's some differences, especially culturally, but they're willing to have that dialogue because we don't ordain women, because we do hold to the 7 ecumenical councils, because we do believe in the 7 sacraments. And so they see that commonality as a starting point.
All right. So we have another question. How do Anglo-Catholics deal with so many other Anglicans who are diehard Calvinists, charismatics, and folks that generally seem like they are more broadly evangelical than many evangelicals I know?
Well, I can tell you that the Anglican tent is pretty big, and it can be very confusing to people. But, I would really encourage our listeners to Google and read the Affirmation of St. Louis. And that's really kind of what classical Anglo-Catholicism is. And what it is what I already stated. We begin with the 7 ecumenical councils, the 7 sacraments, the 2 dominical sacraments being baptism and the Eucharist, and an apostolic succession. And that's our starting point. And so within that, there's unity, but we have to affirm those. And so like the 7 ecumenical councils, the last council, 787, that council we see as valid and authoritative because that's before the church was split and divided between East and West, the Great Schism that happened in 1054. But there are some that do not like that council because it allows for icons and images and worship. And so I think that's kind of where we are. I want to be careful. It's not about being snobbish. I not at all. But it's kind of like, with us, we would say that Anglicans affirm the doctrine and the practice before the Great Schism. And if you can't affirm that, or if you're coming up with something new or something different, then probably at that point, there's any amount of dialogue is probably not going to do a whole lot of good, because that's our starting point.
And to be fair, when I look at that question, how many other church bodies do you think deal with the same question? I'm thinking of Rome, not so much with diehard Calvinists, but charismatics and evangelicals. I mean, every church body kind of has that group.
Yeah. And even in Roman Catholicism, I don't know how pervasive it is, but Jansenism is really kind of like a form of Calvinism. So, yeah. So I think the thing I would underline here is Father and I we've had talks about this. I think it can be really difficult and dicey when you're trying to explain to people what we believe, why we believe this, and then they're pointing to maybe a church their parents go to that's an Anglican church, but the clergy don't wear vestments, they don't believe in the real presence. And so it can be very confusing. And we could sit on here and lie, but that doesn't do anybody any good, right? So the ambiguity can be very confusing for people, and it can also be frustrating for priests as well.
We have one last question here. I recently went to my first service in a continuing Anglican church. The church had about 10 people. No one really talked to me, and I felt like an intruder. The service itself was a bit weird, as the priest had a contrived accent. His sermon was pretty bad. Is this typical in your services? I'm at a loss because my wife is open to Anglicanism, but if I took her to this church, she would never go to an Anglican church again.
Perception is reality,
What do you say to that?
Yeah, I know. Well, I think part of it is the reality is this does happen, unfortunately. But I think, the good news, the silver lining in this is I think this is changing for the better. And I think I know in the APA, I can't speak to other jurisdictions, but in the APA, we don't have guys that just read for holy orders anymore. They actually have to go to a real seminary that's approved by the Board of Examining Chaplains. They have to get a real degree. And then they have to have formation in a parish that is a solid parish. And so I think what we're seeing is that, before when guys tended to just read for holy orders, not all, by the way, there were guys that read for holy orders and they were great priests and did a great job. But there were also those that I think just did not have proper education, proper formation. And I think it was one of those things where if you believed you were being called to be a priest and you had a pulse, then hands were laid on you. And I think we've dealt with the problems of that and we've learned from those mistakes. And I will say this, we even have older priests that are excited about the fact that our standards have been elevated. They appreciate that because they've lived through some of these problems. And I think that's what's probably, I don't know the situation, but that's probably what is being described here. Yeah. Any comments you have there, Father?
The contrived accent thing, it's kind of funny. Do you think that's guys trying to do the liturgy reverently, but then don't, I've seen it both ways, and I've been around. I've been to churches in the South. And it's great. Just use your regular voice, but you don't need to all of a sudden go into like British mode to speak our liturgy.
Yeah, and I think that that's always a temptation for some who kind of view the Anglican Church through very romantic kind of lens. And yeah, you don't want to get up there and have no emotion or just rattle things off as fast as you can. But at the other side of it is this isn't theater. We're not George Whitfield. the theater. Yeah. So
we had it reminds me of when we were in seminary, and I think it was homiletics, and there was this guy, ex-military, but you remember this? He had this very deep, just awesome, booming voice.
Yeah.
And he got up there, and you could tell he was trying to hold back because he thought his voice would be too authoritative and people would take it as yelling. No one ever took it that way, but he was mindful of that. So it was really weird how he talked, almost like Mickey Mouse. And it's like, what are you doing? Don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing. You need to be natural. Obviously, you don't want to use slang or anything, but that's the beauty of the prayer book, and that's the beauty of the missal is it's there written for you. And you just, you say it in a way that is reverent, but not contrived, to use the language here. The other thing I would say, though, that the follow-up question here is this typical in your services? I would probably say it's not typical, but it happens, and probably happens more than it should. So I feel for this person. I've talked with this person actually. Yeah, and especially if you're trying to bring your wife on board and she's open, you don't want to take her to a church like that because that door just closes really fast.
Yeah. Well, if a person goes to any church and the service is done poorly or it's cheesy or whatever, that's a real turnoff because you're not there for gimmicks and games. I guess some people are enticed by that, but the majority of Christians see right through that. And I will also to go back to the first comment you made about education. I know there used to be a history of very high standards for Anglican clergy. And the seminaries here were top notch. And the Orthodox would even send their guys over here to go to Anglican seminaries because the educational standards were so high and the clergy were so learned. And I think we're trying to get back to that.
Yeah. And what happened there, because I know Seabury Western, which is, unfortunately, it's not there anymore, but that was a flagship seminary in Chicago, north of Chicago. But I know Serbians and Romanians would send their guys there to be, to study and everything. What happened was the seminaries started getting into some bizarre higher critical stuff. And then when the women's ordination thing started happening, that unfortunately, I think that was the undoing of the seminaries. And so I think what happened is when the continuum starts, which, think about the history, you're getting into the late 70s when all this is happening. So they needed clergy right away because they were basically, they had lost their building, everything, and they're starting fresh, and they needed somebody that could just go in and lead the people, and they needed somebody now.
Yeah.
And so what started off as probably good intentions developed into some bad practices.
They didn't really have a lot of time to plan and think things through.
Yeah.
And it was a desperate move.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of the decisions hurt them instead of help them.
Yeah. And going back to the first question about ACNA and GAFCON and all that stuff, one of the reasons we have these standards too is so that our clergy are pretty united, I would say very united on who we are, our identity. And so that then trickles down to preaching, how we say the liturgy and all that stuff. And I think one of the things, and this comes from a couple of ACNA priests that I have a lot of respect for, but they've lamented the fact that they never had to go through any kind of Anglican formation or training. And I think that's one of the problems they've had now, and again, I won't be specific. I'm not trying to be provocative, but, when you have, say, for instance, a guy that was really entrenched into a lot of the charismatic stuff, and then you move him through the ranks, and all at once he becomes bishop.
He doesn't just lose those tendencies overnight.
Yeah. And so I think that's some of the issues, because there are good guys. I mean, again, I'm not going to say names, but I just met with an ACNA guy on 2 days ago, and he and I are just right on the same page. He is rock solid, but he was the one lamenting some of this as well.
And I don't think that they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah,
they come into that body, and they're not really aware of the history. They just find a church and they lock in, and they don't know the broader history behind everything. And I know that's where you get a lot of the Calvinistic tendencies of people too, because they either come from a Reformed background or a Presbyterian background, and they keep that theology.
Mm. Yeah.
And then people wonder why they say they're Anglican, but they're really Calvinist.
Yeah.
Well, those clergy weren't vetted.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And, to be fair about all this, I'll go on record and say this. One of the things the ACNA, and I've always thought this about the ACNA and appreciated this, they have a real zeal for evangelism and for missions. And what I'd love to see is, in an ideal world, that we had that same zeal, that same desire to plant missions and to do church planting, revitalization, everything like that. But I think what we have is we have standards. And I think if you could mesh the two of those, you would be a force to be reckoned with. I really do.
Yeah. Well, let's tease out the word evangelical a little bit, because that can mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
So when you call someone an evangelical, what are the good ways that you can call someone an evangelical? And what are the bad ways you can call someone an evangelical? Because I know that can confuse a lot of people, because evangelism is supposed to be a good thing.
Yeah.
On the surface, you say, well, they're evangelical. Wouldn't that be a good thing?
Yeah.
So what does that mean when when some people say it and it's a compliment, and then other people say it and it's a put down?
Yeah. 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 Because the term evangelical just simply means gospel or good news, right? And that's a good term, and so I think in that context, we shouldn't be reactionary and not use that term. The term evangelical is a good term. As a matter of fact, Father Randall and I came from Lutheranism, but we were a part of a group that identified themselves as evangelical and Catholic, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so, I think there's good. I think where it gets a kind of a bad reputation is when it becomes an ism, and it really emphasizes decision theology, kind of a suspicion of the sacraments. What we talked about before, there's a little bit of a Gnostic strain in there where, God works directly to your heart and not necessarily through means. And so, yeah. And so what happens is it's all about the gospel. Well, the gospel is simply Christ died for you, and now you need to surrender your life to him, which there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that's extremely simplistic, and that's not the whole totality of what the church teaches. So let me give you a very concrete example. There are some that would call themselves Anglicans that deny baptismal regeneration. There are Anglicans that deny Christ is really present in the Eucharist. There are Anglicans, and I know I talked to one that's a priest, I won't say where, but that believes that like private confession is pretty much borderline evil. So you see the problem there. So I like the term evangelical, and I think it's a term we should use, But when it becomes an ism and you identify yourself through basically a reduction of getting rid of sacraments, getting rid of the church, and it becomes more of an encounter with God, an existential encounter apart from the church, that's when we start having problems.
Right. It becomes, I don't know a lot of Baptists this way, it becomes that, just give me that old time religion,
Yeah. Or the idea that Jesus came to abolish religion and he was a revolutionary that basically came just to speak the good news. And, and that's, yeah.
I'm reminded of not too long ago, saw on YouTube, and it was about a men's conference. And I could say, the positive and negative from what you just said. The positive here is they had a men's conference with men interested in becoming more faithful, growing deeper in their relationship with Christ and his people, wanted to be better fathers and all that stuff. That's great that they have these things. But the conference begins with, I'm being serious, an 80s metal band playing, what was the Top Gun music, and a tank rolling over cars, and said Chuck Norris is on top of, I'm not kidding. And it's just like, that is so beyond even cheesy.
Yeah.
It's, we laugh, but can you imagine being a guy who actually like, hey, I could do better. I want to be, more faithful. I want to be involved in my church. I want to be a leader. I want to step up. I want to be a good father. I want to be a good husband and all this stuff. And then your conference begins with a tank and just, I don't know. So yeah. So it's good that outreach is there. But the other side of it is like, what's really the content? It's just, very cultural driven. And
I went to it was a Christian college that, very evangelical, and they were against any kind of images, icons, all that. But the founder, he had just died recently, and they unveiled this huge painting that was a life-size painting of him. And and I guess that's part of the thing with evangelicalism, which I think is changing because, you've had the downfall of so many of these leaders, whether it's Ravi Zacharias, Bill Hybels, I mean, you can go on and on. And I think part of it is there was almost kind of a prophetic looking for the next prophet, and I would even go back to even a guy like John Knox,
right,
who really kind of saw himself as a prophet.
Right.
And in the Anglo-Catholic world, we don't have any life-size, portraits of famous Anglo-Catholic leaders or people, because the idea is the tradition is what's important. And we're a part of that tradition, but no one person stands above that tradition. No.
I think there's something too in this question, and I think you could probably speak to it pretty well, Father. Churches, we've been in the Lutheran Church, we've been in the Anglican Church, we both served at many different parishes. And just people are people. They can be cliquish and everything. So this idea, so you have a small church and it has 10 people, and cliques are going to happen. But with a clique of 10, you're not going to have much outreach, and it's going to be hard to. But when you started here at St. Philip's, you had 6. So do you kind of want to speak to that, how to build a culture of outreach and welcoming and everything? Does it just depend upon the congregation's personality, or can a priest do something to foster, more of a culture of being welcoming? And, if you have a congregation of 10, a visitor, you would think, you'd want to be welcoming and not just like, oh, you don't know our liturgy, da, 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 da.
Yeah. Well, I can speak on that briefly. I actually met with those 6 people before I ever even decided to come here, and I just laid out, this is what I would do if I came. Am I going to get resistance to that or anything? And I could just tell they were really excited about the possibility of having a priest and having, a family here. And so I think a lot of it depends on the people themselves. Here, they had actually met with a realtor and was talking about the possibility of selling the building. So I think at that point, they I wouldn't say desperate, but I think they knew that if we got sidetracked with a lot of silly, territorial issues, that'd be the end of it. So I think I had even though it was six people that were pretty motivated to work with me. And I know this is tough. It's tough for me. You said it earlier, people are people. It's tough to trust people today. But the thing about them is they did trust me, and that went a long way. And so I think I tried to also be pretty transparent with them up front. And so, yeah, so I think that's been a big part of it. And yeah, so I think it can be done. And I think, if you have 10 people and you sit them down, or the bishop sits them down and says, look, we're going to close unless we do some things very differently. And that might not be your preference, but you've got to be on board for that. I think then you have a real shot. But if the people that's not the way we did it, that's not, in 1979 when we started, that's not what we did, and we're not going to do anything different. I think at that point, a priest has to say that's not the right fit. So,
and it just, as you're talking, kind of in the context of everything we've been talking about, GAFCON, ACNA, and everything else like that. So we went from smaller church to, larger church. Larger church, so like a church body can have that same attitude, right? Can be very, get into very cliquish, and we're not going to talk with them. We're going to, only our group. I mean, even the fact we're reaching out to Rome in the East, I imagine there's some being like, well, why would we do that? Because we just want Anglicans. And it's like, our view of the church is not just us, we have a bigger view. So,
yeah, no, that's a good point. And Bishop talked about this on one of the earlier episodes. I think it was on the ecumenism. But yeah, there's a lot of talks going on. I mean, we've been talking to the Polish National Catholic Church. Obviously, we entered this full sacramental union with the G3, which is great. And that's the Anglican Catholic Church and the Anglican Church in America and the traditional Anglican Church out of Canada. So, yeah, so I think we've made some good steps. I think there's a lot more to be done, and hopefully that'll happen.
Guess that wraps up all of our questions that we received. If you folks have any more questions, please send them our way. You can leave us a comment on YouTube, on Spotify, on iTunes, or you can send us an email at podcast@stphillipsblacksburg.org or podcast@anglicanprovince.org, and we will address them in a future episode just like this one. Thanks so much, and we will see you again next week.